In early autumn of 2023, after nearly 2 years of quiet legal maneuvering and estate negotiations, George Michael's riverside home in Goring-on-Thames was finally sold. The buyer was a couple from London, David and Alina Dyer. They were in their late 30s, both professionals in the digital media industry, worn down by city life and eager to trade it for countryside calm. The house, an 18th century, cream-colored brick residence known simply as Mill Cottage, sat beside the Thames like a secret, nestled among weeping willows and protected by thick hedges. Locals still left flowers by the gate each Christmas, quietly mourning the pop legend who died there in his sleep on December 25, 2016. The Dyers weren't superstitious, but Alina had paused when the estate agent casually mentioned the exact date of George's passing. "It's beautiful," she had said. "A little eerie, but beautiful." They moved in mid-October. It rained almost every day for the first 2 weeks. Mill Cottage was elegant and tasteful. Nothing flashy. Despite some modern updates, much of it had been left untouched. George's favorite reading room, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and tall, narrow windows, had been preserved by the previous caretakers. A faint trace of expensive cologne lingered in the air. David often worked from home, setting up his laptop on the kitchen island. The first strange thing he noticed wasn't dramatic, just off. The living room clock started ticking, even though it had no batteries. The old record player in the study spun faintly at night, no sound, just movement. A framed black-and-white photo of George, taken decades ago during a quiet moment on the couch, refused to stay straight. Alina would adjust it every morning, and by nightfall it tilted left again. "Settling noises," David shrugged. "Old house stuff." But Alina was less convinced. She'd lie awake some nights, listening. Floorboards creaked in empty rooms. Faint humming drifted from the hallway, low and mournful. Once, she found the guest bedroom window wide open after she knew she'd locked it. Then came the notes. 3 weeks before Christmas, Alina discovered a folded piece of parchment slipped between the pages of a cookbook in the kitchen drawer. It was a handwritten letter, and signed, but unmistakably George's voice, witty, raw, vulnerable. It wasn't a fan letter. It read more like a confession, a message to himself. If they knew how quiet it gets, how hollow, the silence after the applause. "Sometimes I feel like the house is listening, waiting to see if I'll give in." She showed it to David. He insisted it was an old leftover, nothing more. He was a complicated man. Don't read too much into it. But the next day, another letter appeared. This one lay beneath the Christmas ornaments in the attic. It wasn't there before they were sure of it. Alina recognized the handwriting now, and the message was different, almost directed at them. "They've moved in. I wonder if they'll hear it too." The sigh in the walls. The sadness that doesn't leave. That night, the lights flickered in the old reading room. The stereo turned on by itself and played a few bars of A Different Corner before stopping abruptly. They didn't sleep. December 24th. Alina woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of whistling. Soft, deliberate. She got out of bed and followed it down the hall, barefoot on cold wooden floors. The whistling stopped at the reading room. She pushed open the door. There, standing by the window, was a man's silhouette, slim, head slightly bowed, hands in the pockets of a long coat. The moonlight poured through the glass, but the figure had no face, no eyes, just absence. Not threatening, not evil, just unbearably sad. Alina didn't scream. She only whispered, "George." The figure turned, just enough to suggest acknowledgement. And then it vanished like a trick of light folding in on itself. In its place, on the small antique table near the wall, sat a leather-bound journal that neither of them had ever seen. Inside were dated entries from the final months of his life. Heartbreak, loneliness, love never returned, the pressures of fame, and a recurring dream, a house that keeps me, a house that won't let me go. After the holidays, the Dyers called in a spiritual medium. Not for theatrics, just answers. The woman walked through the cottage slowly, murmuring to herself. Finally, in George's former bedroom, she placed a hand on the wall and said, "He's not stuck here. He just doesn't know how to leave." This house was his refuge, his sorrow, his cathedral. The Dyers faced a decision. Some would have moved out, sold the place, walked away. But Alina said something that surprised even her husband. Let him stay. And so they did. They learned to live with the presence. The cold spots, the records that played without warning, the laughter, distant and hollow, drifting from the study. But no more fear, only reverence. To this day, every December 25th, they light a single candle by the window and leave the stereo on. George's voice fills the house, just for a while. Then it's quiet again. Not empty, never empty, just quiet. The river swelled that January. Weeks of rain had saturated the ground, and the Thames, silver gray and glassy beneath a sky the color of tarnished pewter, began to inch toward the back garden of Mill Cottage. A frail fog often hovered above the waterline in the early mornings, clinging to the hedges like something sentient, as if it too were observing the house. Inside, time moved differently. The rooms breathed, not in the metaphorical sense, but with a tangible pulse. David noticed it first when he stood in the old kitchen one evening, alone, sipping from a chipped ceramic mug they'd found tucked in the rear of a cupboard. It had Faith painted on it in faded, looping script, clearly once part of some merchandise collection, but personal in a way mass-produced things rarely were. The handle was just slightly too small for his fingers, but he kept using it. That night, as he stood by the window watching the rain blur the glass, he felt something shift behind him. Not air, pressure, like the whole house had sighed. A slow exhalation that passed through the wooden beams and into the bones of the structure itself. He turned, expecting Alina, but there was no one. He heard the soft tick of the batteryless clock. Tick, tick, tick. He turned back to the window, and for just a second, he saw the faintest outline of a man's face reflected in the glass just over his shoulder. The lips were parted, as if mid-song. The next morning, Alina found water pooled beneath the old chaise lounge in the study. At first she thought the roof had begun leaking, but when she bent down and touched it, the liquid wasn't cold. It was warm and salty, like tears. No trace of it anywhere else. Just a perfect, silent puddle beneath the velvet upholstery. The books on the shelf had been rearranged too, subtly, entire rows tilted forward, spines leaning out as if listening. One book lay on the floor, Oscar Wilde's De Profundis, open to a page underlined in what looked like pencil. Sorrow, then, and all that it teaches one, has been the only thing which could bring me any knowledge or any touch of reality. The graphite looked fresh. David didn't want to talk about it. Not directly. He changed the subject whenever she brought up the noises, or the way her phone glitched only when she was in George's former bedroom. Static in the walls, he'd mumble. These old places are full of interference. But at night, when he thought Alina was asleep, he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the hallway. Sometimes he whispered, "What do you want?" He never got an answer, not one that used words. February arrived like a hush. Snow dusted the hedgerows, and the bare branches outside the bedroom window scratched softly against the glass like fingers looking for purchase. Alina had begun to document the house's mood, subtle changes in air pressure, rooms that remained inexplicably warm even when the heating was off, the recurring scent of tobacco and sandalwood in the corridor at dusk. She kept a small journal on the nightstand. February 9 to 4:17 a.m. Door to the music room creaked open by itself. I thought I heard piano keys, only 2, maybe 3. Soft, like someone testing them before a song. February 14 to 11:40 p.m. Someone whispered in the bathroom. I thought it was David, but he was asleep. It wasn't English. Maybe Greek. February 21 to 1:02 a.m. I smelled blood orange and leather. I don't wear perfume anymore. It came from the wardrobe. But it wasn't until the last week of the month that something changed. Something darker. It began with the bird. David found it early one morning, just outside the reading room, a small blackbird, lying dead on the wooden floor near the rug. No broken window, no open doors. It had simply appeared. There was no blood, no wound, but its neck had been twisted unnaturally, as though it had turned its head too far to look at something behind it. He buried it under the yew tree out back, near the river. That same night, the stereo turned on again. But this time, it didn't play George. Played static. Just that pure white hiss like dead air from an old analog signal. Continued for exactly 1 minute, then cut to silence. Alina sat up in bed, hands clenched under the duvet. David didn't move. In the hallway, the floor creaked. Not one step, several. Steady. Heavy. Like someone pacing with intent. Then silence. Then the faint, unmistakable sound of a man weeping. The attic door was open the next morning. They never left it open. The pull-down ladder extended fully, as if inviting. Alina stood at the base, barefoot on the hallway floor, her breath visible in the sudden cold. She called David. He didn't respond. She climbed alone, step by cautious step, into the dark. The attic was surprisingly empty, no clutter, no cobwebs, just exposed beams and dusty floorboards, dry and cracked. And in the middle, like it had been placed with care, sat a piano stool. Nothing else, except one more letter, folded neatly, handwritten. The ink had bled slightly at the edges, as if someone had wept while writing it. She read the first line and dropped it, not out of fear but recognition. It was addressed to her. Alina, I'm sorry you feel it. I never wanted anyone else to carry it. But you're listening now, aren't you? That's all I ever wanted. Someone to hear me. The house groaned, loud and long, the beams above her moaning like a ship on a stormy sea. Then silence. A deep, perfect silence, like the pause before the very last note of a song. After the attic, things began to shift in ways that couldn't be denied, even by David. He stopped making excuses. No more blaming faulty wiring, humidity, or his own stress levels. He couldn't. Not after he found the voice recorder. It was tucked inside the old bench by the main staircase, the one they never used. A small black Sony model, the kind George might have used for lyrics or melodic fragments. The batteries inside were corroded, dead. But when David pressed play, the screen flickered to life. There was no date on the file. No title. Just the faint sound of breathing. Not frantic, not tired, composed. Steady. Then a voice. Low. Unmistakable. British but delicate, vulnerable. This house remembers everything. It listens when no one else does. A pause. Shuffling. A faint clink, maybe a glass. If I vanish here, let them know it wasn't loneliness that did it. It was memory. It was too much remembering. The audio clicked off and the screen went black. The device hasn't turned on since. The next week was almost serene. No new noises. No objects moved. The house settled or pretended to. Alina didn't trust it. She wandered the halls more often now, barefoot, holding her notebook like a lifeline. She was thinner, paler. Her dreams had become layered, some memories, some fragments that didn't belong to her. A smell of gin. The image of a recording studio lit only by a red bulb. A mirror shattered at its center, as if something inside had pushed outward. She started talking to George at night. Not out loud, but not silently either. Something in between. A kind of whispered transmission. She'd lie in the bed, eyes on the ceiling, and just say things she thought he might need to hear. I would have stayed with you, she murmured once. I would have listened. March opened like a door. They woke one morning to find a portrait had appeared on the wall of the music room. It hadn't been there the day before. The hook had no dust on it. The frame was slightly crooked, just enough to suggest someone had placed it in a hurry. The painting was delicate, abstract. A swirl of cool blues and greens, overlaid with thin white brushstrokes that resembled lyrics. But you couldn't read them. They blurred as you looked. There was no signature, no note, but Alina knew what it was. It's a gift, she whispered. David didn't reply. He had stopped going into the music room altogether. That same week, David found himself waking in the guest bedroom. Not by choice. He never remembered walking there. He'd go to bed beside Alina and wake, hours later, lying stiff on the guest mattress, with the same recurring image in his mind. A river. Frozen. Still. And beneath the surface, a face not dead, not drowning, but waiting. Eyes open, watching. It was late March when they invited their first guest since moving in. An old university friend of Alina's named Joe, an actress and self-proclaimed skeptic of all that ghostly rubbish. She arrived with wine and a bright scarf, and didn't stop talking for 2 hours. The house didn't like her. Within 20 minutes of Joe entering the reading room, the stereo flicked on by itself and played the opening bars of Waiting for That Day. Joe laughed, thinking it was a gag. Alina didn't. Later that night, as Joe prepared to leave, she found her scarf torn lying in the fireplace. The wine glass she had used had a long, thin crack along the rim, as if it had been scored deliberately. "I'm sorry," Alina told the empty living room after Joe left. She didn't mean anything by it. The house didn't respond. Not directly. But the next day, the entire upstairs hallway was freezing, breath cloud cold. And in the master bathroom mirror, written faintly in condensation from a shower neither of them had taken, were 4 words. She wasn't the one. By April, the house had grown intimate. Alina stopped writing in her notebook. She didn't need to. The events weren't external anymore. They were felt. Music would begin faintly from behind closed doors, songs George never released. Snippets, fragments. She recognized the rhythm but not the lyrics. Soft vocals humming low. Melancholy. Beautiful. Like someone singing to himself in a room too large for one person. One afternoon, while watering the garden, she caught sight of something in the upstairs window, a shadow, standing still, one hand pressed lightly against the glass. Not threatening, just there, watching her. She waved. It didn't wave back, but the curtain moved, ever so slightly. David grew quiet, not frightened, withdrawn. He spent more time by the river now, standing on the bank, staring into the water. Sometimes Alina would join him and say nothing. They'd just look. Together. The river made no sound, but occasionally, they both heard something beneath it. Beneath the water's hush. A note. A single note, held too long, impossibly long. As if someone were trying to sustain a final chord. They didn't tell anyone. Who could they tell? Who would believe that a house could ache? That memory could imprint itself so deeply it became architecture? That grief, when saturated with music, could echo into eternity? One morning in late April, Alina opened the door to the garden and found an envelope on the doorstep. Unmarked. No postage. Inside was a photograph. A candid one, George Michael, seated cross-legged on a leather sofa, smiling gently, hand over his heart, eyes distant but full. It looked like a private moment. An image not meant to be seen, not meant to be found. Written in fading blue pen on the back were 5 words. "Thank you for staying. Gee." She wept, quietly, like the house had taught her. And behind her, through the open door, the stereo came to life once more. The voice that filled the air was tender, wounded, glorious. "I think you're amazing." By the time summer arrived, the house had grown quieter, not because the presence had left, but because it had settled into them, like a second skin. The air no longer felt heavy, felt aware, listening. David no longer questioned anything. He had stopped checking the fuse box. He didn't wince at the cold spots or pretend the stereo was reacting to some signal in the walls. The man who once sought logic now sat at George's old piano each night, touching the keys with reverence. Though he didn't play, he just sat, breathing with the house. Alina had become the house's voice. She had taken to recording herself reading George's old interviews out loud, softly, like bedtime stories. She felt closer to him when she spoke his words. Sometimes she swore she heard responses. Not words, but small acknowledgments, a whisper of warmth at her shoulder, a breeze passing only by her ear. And then, one night in July, it ended. Or perhaps, more truthfully, it finished. It was late. They had gone to bed early, tired from a long day in the garden. Alina awoke around 2 a.m. to music, not from the stereo this time, but from upstairs. From the attic. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Piano slow, deliberate. A melody she didn't recognize. Something original. A final composition. She sat up. David was already awake, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling like he, too, had been waiting for this. Neither spoke. They rose together, as if pulled by invisible threads, and climbed the stairs in silence. The air grew warmer with every step. By the time they reached the landing, it smelled of cedarwood, leather, and something citrusy, the same scent that had followed Alina in her dreams. The attic door was open, the ladder already down, and up there they saw it. Not George, but something shaped by his absence. A warm light filled the space, not from bulbs, not from moonlight, but from something like memory itself, glowing in the bones of the wood. In the center of the room, the old piano stool was gone, replaced by the upright piano that had once belonged to George. The same one from his studio, with the worn brass pedals and polished ivory keys. But there was no one sitting at it. The music still played. No hands touched the keys, but the melody filled the attic like breath, flowing around them, inside them. It wasn't sad. It wasn't joyful either. It was complete. Then slowly it faded. The final note hung in the air far longer than it should have. Sustained beyond natural vibration. It felt like a farewell, not dramatic, not sorrowful, just at peace. And then silence. Total, encompassing silence. The next day they explored the attic again. The piano was gone. Only the dust was disturbed, as if someone had danced in place and vanished. They never heard the stereo again. No footsteps in the hallway. No notes left behind. But the house was not empty. Felt full. Full in the way an old book feels full, even after you've finished it, because it holds every word that mattered, and nothing that didn't. David and Alina stayed. They still live there. Quietly. Kindly. The ghost is gone, perhaps. But George? He's still there. In the music room. In the way the floorboards creak when no one is walking. In the light that lingers just a little too long at sunset. In the breath between songs. And in the peace that only comes once everything that needed to be said has finally been heard. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.